Welcome to Environmental Science. We're starting off with Chapter 1 with our textbook, which is The Essential Environment, the Science Behind the Stories, the 5th edition by Withcott and Laposada, published by Pearson. Our Chapter 1 is Science and Sustainability, an Introduction to Environmental Science. Our first lecture for Chapter 1 will help us understand the following: the term environment and the field of environmental science, natural resources and ecosystem services, population growth and resource consumption, the scientific method and the process and nature of science, environmental ethics, global environmental pressures, and concepts of sustainability and a sustainable development. Our first question: what comes to mind when you hear the word environment? Think about that for a minute. Some people might picture something in nature like trees or animals, oceans, or something to that effect. Now I'll ask you the question: did you picture in your mind, when you thought of the word environment, did you picture yourself in the environment or other people in the environment? Something to think about. Our first section of Chapter 1 has an interesting title called Our Island Earth. It'd be kind of interesting to think of Earth as an island. The Earth may seem enormous to us. Viewed from space, our home planet resembles a small blue marble suspended in a vast inky black void. Earth may seem enormous to us as we go about our lives on its surface. It seems enormous to us when you're in an airplane and you look horizon to horizon. But if an astronaut were to view the Earth, it actually probably kind of looks like an island in space. It reveals that our planet is finite and limited. Whatever we have here, it's all we've got. With this perspective, it becomes clear that as our population, technological power, and resource consumption all increase, so does our capacity to alter our surroundings and damage the very systems that keep us alive. Finding ways to live peacefully, healthfully, and sustainably on our diverse and complex planet is our society's prime challenge today. The field of environmental science is crucial in this endeavor. The environment consists of all the living and the non-living things around us. Living things are also called biotic, and non-living things are called abiotic. Continents, oceans, clouds, ice caps, those items would all be abiotic. Items like animals, plants, and forests, those are all biotic items. We also have other things like structures and urban centers and living spaces and social relationships and institutions in our environment. People commonly use the term environment in the narrowest sense to mean like the natural world or the non-human part of the world, but in all reality, we have to remember that humans are actually a part of the environment. Is human society separate from the environment? And I hope you would answer absolutely not to that question. We exist within the environment, and we depend on a healthy, functioning planet. The fundamental insights of environmental science are that we are indeed a part of the natural world, and the organisms that we are, we also change it, and sometimes drastically. Our interactions with each other and with other organisms and with other abiotic items matter a great, great deal. Everything that we have on Earth, in the environment, we completely depend on for survival. And if we take care of it, we can have maybe increased health and longer lives, wealth, mobility, and leisure. But unfortunately, as humans, we've degraded some of the natural systems by pollution, soil erosion, and species extinction. Environmental changes definitely can threaten our long-term well-being and our survival. Environmental science is the study of how the natural world works, but also how the environment affects humans and how humans affect the environment. We need to understand our interactions with the environment. By understanding these interactions, we can hopefully devise solutions to our many pressing challenges. It can be daunting to reflect on the sheer magnitude of dilemmas that confront us today, but these problems also bring countless opportunities for creative solutions. After all, as humans with our big brains, we're able to critically think, and information these days is coming in at huge speeds. We're gaining information and scientific knowledge more rapidly than ever before, and we can share information globally. We still have the opportunity to solve problems. With such bountiful opportunities, this moment in history is actually an exciting time to be alive and to be studying environmental science. When we think of Earth as an island, like we thought of at the beginning of the chapter, just like any other island, islands are finite and bounded, and their inhabitants must cope with limitations in the materials that they need. There's only so much stuff here. Some of it, though, is actually renewable, and some of it's non-renewable. Our natural resources are the substances and the energy sources that we need for survival. The renewable ones, the renewable natural resources, those can be replenished over short periods of time. Luckily, things like sunlight and wind and wave energy and even geothermal energy are renewable and perpetually renewed. Other items that are renewed over short periods of time but can be depleted if we use them too quickly are things like timber and water and soil, and even organisms, including biodiversity. Non-renewable items, there's only a limited amount of those things on Earth. So once we use them up, once we deplete them, those items are no longer available. Those are items like minerals and crude oil, coal, natural gas. If we think of natural resources as goods produced by nature, then it's also true that Earth's natural systems provide services upon which we depend. Our planet's ecological systems purify air and water and cycle nutrients. They regulate climate and pollinate plants and even recycle our own wastes. These essential services are commonly called ecosystem services. Unfortunately, as we use up natural resources, we also degrade ecosystem services. We deplete resources, we destroy habitat, and generate pollution. And increased human affluence and population have intensified this degradation. As of now, there's over 7 billion humans on Earth. For nearly all of human history, actually, fewer than 1 million people populated the Earth at any given time. But today, for every one person who used to exist, there's 7,000 people that exist today. And actually, it's actually a pretty recent and sudden monumental change in human population that's taken place. We've had some things that have helped us to increase our population to such great numbers. One of the first things that really helped was the agricultural revolution about 10,000 years ago. Growing crops and livestock actually led to sedentary lives. It was easier to get food that way. We no longer had to rely on the system of hunter and gathering. And these stable food supplies actually increased our survival and our ability to have even more children. And therefore, of course, populations of humans increased. The Industrial Revolution in the mid-1700s, when it began, and also included in the 1800s and 1900s, and even today, has really fostered our human population growth. Urbanized society is now powered by fossil fuels like oil, gas, and coal. We have much, much better sanitation and medicines, which has decreased our diseases and such. And pesticides and fertilizers have increased our crop yields, letting us feed more people. I've always found this chart here, this graph of human population, very remarkable. Taking a look at when the agricultural revolution began here, 10,000 years ago, how the population maintains itself quite stably. It doesn't really rise very much until, bang, you can see the Industrial Revolution right around here happening mid-1700s, going into the 1800s, 1900s, and we get exponential population growth. It just increases so rapidly. But again, because of industry, because of sanitation and medicines, pesticides and fertilizers, we've actually been able to grow that way as a human population in our environment. The factors driving population growth have brought us better lives in many ways, yet as our world fills with more and more people, the population growth of humans has begun to threaten our very well-being. We must ask how well the planet can actually accommodate the 9 billion people that's forecasted by the year 2050. Already, our sheer numbers, unparalleled in history, are putting unprecedented stress on natural systems and the availability of resources. Besides stimulating population growth, industrialization has increased the amount of resources that each of us actually consumes. By mining energy sources and manufacturing more goods, we've enhanced the material affluence of many of the world's people. In the process, however, we've consumed more and more of the planet's limited resources. We can learn from an individual named Garrett Hardin, and we'll look at this a little bit more in chapter 5 on page 100 in his published works, The Tragedy of the Commons, which that it states that unregulated exploitation of public resources leads to depletion and damage, such as if many people were grazing their animals on a certain area of land and nobody owned it, people would become selfish and want to graze more and more and more of their animals until it was overgrazed and then becomes useless to everyone. Um, this could also include cutting down of forests, the use of air and water and other natural resources. Resource users are motivated by self-interest, meaning they increase the use of the resources until the resource is gone, which is very selfish. So in Chapter 5, we'll take a look at some of the solutions to this tragedy of the commons, such as private ownership. If someone actually owns the land, then there's more incentive to take care of it. Also, voluntary organizations to enforce responsible use and government regulations also seem to be in the best interest, to have rules to using resources and to help preserve them. In the 1990s, the term ecological footprint was developed by scientists Mathis Wackernagel and William Rees. It expresses the cumulative area of biologically productive land and water required to provide the resources a person or a population consumes, and to dispose of or recycle the wastes that the person or population produces. It measures the total area of Earth's biologically productive surface that a given person or population uses once all direct and indirect impacts are totaled up. Hence the word ecological footprint. It's kind of like drawing money out of a bank account rather than living off the interest that the money makes. And to look at this another way, it would take 1.5 years for the planet to regenerate the renewable resources that people use in a year. And so we're doing what's called overshooting, which is our next slide. We've surpassed Earth's capacity to sustainably support us. If we take a look at our ecological footprint on this graph back from about the 1960s or so, it's quite low. And biocapacity is what the Earth can handle. So we're very well below that in the 60s, although gaining in the 70s and 80s, and then overshooting in the 80s. And look at in the 2000s where it is today, we have well overshot what scientists believe the Earth can handle. We're using renewable resources 50% faster than we're able to replenish them. In fact, going back to the last slide, if everyone consumed the amount of resources that the U.S. does, we would need 4 Earths. Some scientists have actually criticized the methods by which the Global Footprint Network calculates ecological footprints, and many question the methods on how we measure the overshoot. And it is quite a complex problem to try to put a number to. But one thing does seem certain, that people that are in rich nations have a much larger ecological footprint than those that are not. For instance, wealthy nations like the United States have a larger ecological footprint than others from poorer nations like Kenya. Environmental science, the science of that, helps us to avoid past mistakes. If we can look back at what has happened to other civilizations, then perhaps we can learn from those mistakes and help avoid them. Historians have inferred that environmental degradation contributed to the fall of the Greek and the Roman empires, the Angkor civilization of Southeast Asia, the Maya, the Anasazi, and other civilizations of the Americas. Even once lush regions like Iraq are now barren deserts. At one time, they were thriving societies, but no longer. The area of Easter Island, which is the topic of our story in Chapter 1, the science behind the story, starting on page 6, going on to page 7, are also an example of this, where civilizations, which were once great and running very well, failed, most likely due to environmental degradation. Civilizations succeed or fail according to how they interact with the environment and how they respond to problems. And history shows us this. Environmental science can hopefully help us build a better world. Environmental scientists examine how Earth's natural systems function and how these systems affect people and how we influence these systems. Many environmental scientists are motivated by a desire to develop solutions to environmental problems. These solutions, like new technologies, policies, or research management strategies, are applications of environmental science. The study of such applications and their consequences is, in turn, also a part of environmental science. Environmental science is a broad interdisciplinary field. It includes the natural sciences, which examine the natural world, and therefore then would be called an environmental science program, but those that focus more on the human interactions and institutions aspect of it often call themselves environmental studies programs. Whichever approach is used, the fields bring together many diverse perspectives and sources of knowledge. This interdisciplinary approach to addressing environmental problems can produce effective solutions for societies. For instance, when automobiles used gas before the 1970s, and in the 1970s, they used to add lead to the gasoline, and it was supposed to make the cars run more smoothly. Even though research showed that lead emissions from tailpipes actually caused health problems, including brain damage and premature death. In the 1970s, air pollution was severe, and motor vehicles accounted for 78% of the U.S. lead emissions. In response, scientists and officials from different integrated areas got together and looked at the facts and used their knowledge together to bring about a ban on leaded gasoline. And by 1996, all gasoline sold in the United States was unleaded. And by doing this, environmental scientists, engineers, medical research, and policy makers got rid of or completely eliminated our nation's largest source of atmospheric lead pollution. Although many environmental scientists are interested in solving problems, it would be incorrect to confuse environmental science with environmentalism. Environmental science is the pursuit of knowledge about the environment and our interactions with it. And in doing environmental science, scientists try to hold true to the nature of science, meaning they try to remain objective and free from bias, free from personal values and preconceptions. Although as humans, that is hard to do, and often some of the questions that we ask about the environment come from our very own values and such. Environmental scientists try their hardest to maintain true science. Environmentalism is more of a social movement. These individuals are dedicated to protecting the natural world from, of course, human-caused changes. This leads us into our topic in our chapter, where we take a look at what science actually is, or what we call the nature of science. Science is a systematic process for learning about the world and then testing our understanding of it. The body of knowledge arising from the dynamic process of questioning and observation and testing and discovery. Knowledge gained from science can solve society's needs, where we can develop technologies and inform policy and management decisions. Scientists are motivated to develop useful applications and understand how the world works. Scientific knowledge is applied in engineering and technology and in policy and management decisions, such as energy efficient automobiles, developing those, and also in prescribed burning, which is a forest management practice that's actually informed by ecological research. Science tests ideas by examining evidence. Science asks and answers questions. Scientists do not simply accept conventional wisdom, they judge ideas by the strength of their evidence. Observational or descriptive science, information is gathered about organisms, systems, processes, etc., also called qualitative science as well. Cannot be manipulated by experiments. The phenomena are observed and measured, and often used in areas of science like astronomy, paleontology, taxonomy, and genomics. Some of the strongest science, hypothesis-driven science, is targeted, very focused, structured research. Experiments test hypotheses using what's called the scientific method. Actually, a very traditional approach to science. The scientific method tests ideas with observations. The scientist makes an observation and asks questions about some certain phenomenon. They create a hypothesis, which is a statement that tries to answer the question. The hypothesis then generates predictions as to how the scientist thinks the results will go. And these specific statements then should be able to be directly tested. In an experiment, it tests the validity of a prediction or a hypothesis. A hypothesis, during an experiment, a scientist will gather data or evidence that may or may not refute the hypothesis. The variables are conditions that can change or be manipulated. The data are analyzed and interpreted by statistical tests. and then the experiment either supports or rejects the hypothesis. For example, a scientist could test the prediction linking algal growth to fertilizer by selecting two identical ponds and adding fertilizer to one of them. In this example, the fertilizer input would be the independent variable. This is the variable that can be manipulated. Whereas the quantity of algae that results would be the dependent variable. This is the variable that would depend on the independent variable, or the fertilizer input. If the two ponds are identical, except for the single independent variable, which is the fertilizer input, then any differences that arise between the ponds can be attributed to the changes in the independent variable. Such an experiment then is known as a controlled experiment, because the scientist controls for the effects of all variables except the one that the scientist is testing. In this example, the pond left unfertilized would serve as the control, or the unmanipulated point of comparison for the manipulated treatment pond. Whenever possible, it's best to replicate one's experiments. That is, to stage multiple tests of the same comparison. Our scientists then, for example, could perform a replicated experiment on possibly 10 pairs of ponds, adding fertilizer to one of each pair. The data, or such as the amount of algae growth, could be expressed as a number, or a bit of quantitative data, information that's expressed by numbers. Manipulative experiments reveal causal relationships. The independent variable is manipulated, and whatever yields the strongest evidence. And long-term, large-scale processes can't be manipulated, which then makes that very difficult. Though manipulative experiments are very strong experiments and reveal causal relationships, it's often hard to do manipulative experiments in nature, such as for global warming. It would be very difficult to do that. So it's common for researchers to run what's called natural experiments instead, which compare how dependent variables are expressed in naturally different contexts, and then to search for correlation or statistical association among variables. So I'll give you an example. For instance, let's suppose our scientist that was studying the algae in the ponds, instead of the controlled experiment that this person ran in a controlled environment, instead in nature, our scientists would study or survey 50 ponds and might find that 25 of them happen to be fed by fertilizer runoff from nearby farm fields and 25 are not. Let's say that he or she finds 7 times more algae in the fertilized ponds. Then the scientists may conclude that algae growth is correlated with fertilizer input. That is, that one tends to increase along with the other. This tends to provide weaker evidence, or it's not as strong as the manipulative experiments, but it might be the only feasible approach given the natural circumstances. But nonetheless, good correlative studies can make for very strong science. either way, and they preserve the real-world complexity that manipulative experiments often sacrifice. Scientific research takes place within the context of a community of peers. To have impact, a researcher's work must be published and made accessible to this community. Thus, the scientific method is embedded within a larger process involving the scientific community as a whole. When a researcher's work is complete and the results are analyzed, the scientist writes up the findings and then submits them to a journal, usually a scholarly publication in which scientists share their work. The journal's editor asks several other scientists that specialize in that subject area to examine that manuscript and provide comments and criticism, and to judge whether the work merits publication in that journal. This is known as peer review, and it's a very important part of the scientific process. Often, scientists will present their findings or present their works at conferences. They're able to interact with other colleagues there and receive comments on their work. And this can actually help improve the scientists' processes. Scientists often have to find outside sources to fund their research, so they may have to apply for grants and other funding from private or government resources, such as the National Science Foundation is an example. These grant applications actually undergo peer review as well. Sometimes scientists' reliance on funding sources can occasionally lead to conflicts of interest. A researcher that obtains data showing his or her funding source is in an unfavorable light may be reluctant to publish those results for fear of losing the funding, or worse yet, could be tempted to doctor the results. The situation can arise, for instance, when an industry funds research to see whether its foods are healthy. Most scientists, though, resist those pressures, but of course, whenever you are assessing a scientific study, it is always good to know where the researchers got their funding from. Scientific works should also be repeatable. The careful scientists may test a hypothesis repeatedly in various ways. Even following publication, other scientists should be able to repeat those same experiments and reproduce the results. A theory. It's a well-tested and widely accepted explanation. You may have heard in regular speech with other people that they have a theory about something, or something is just a theory. But in science, theories are very, very, very important. They're widely accepted, they're well-tested, and they've been extensively validated by a great amount of research. It's a conceptual framework that explains a phenomenon and has undergone extensive and rigorous testing, such that the confidence in it is extremely strong. For example, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection over the last 150 years has been tested by many different areas of science, with evidence added to it. Other prominent scientific theories include the atomic theory, cell theory, Big Bang theory, plate tectonics, and general relativity. Even the Earth, not the Sun, is the center of the universe. At one time, um, was thought to be an explanation for something. But something called a paradigm shift, meaning a new dominant view, would replace that old one. And that would take, of course, evidence to do that. So we find today that the sun even is actually not the center of the universe either. That we have our own solar system here where not the earth, but the sun is the center of our solar system. But for a while, people underwent a lot of problems when they tried to say anything otherwise. So sometimes paradigm shifts take a lot of time and a lot of evidence in order to come into place. Even the fact that plate tectonics moves the continents took a while. People's ethical perspectives, worldviews, and cultural backgrounds influence how we apply scientific knowledge. Therefore, in environmental science, we take a look at what's called environmental ethics. Ethics is the study of good and bad and right and wrong. The set of moral principles or values held by a person or a society that can tell us how we ought to behave. People use criteria, standards, or rules when making judgments of right and wrong. And different cultures or worldviews lead to different values, leading to different right or wrong actions. Thus, in specific actions, people of different cultures or worldviews may differ in their values, and thus in the specific actions they consider to be right or wrong. And this is why some ethicists are what are called relativists. They believe that ethics do and should vary with social context. But then there's those that uphold that there is kind of a universality between what different cultures feel is right and wrong, and therefore they're called universalists, meaning the notions of right and wrong remain the same across cultures and situations. Ethical standards are the criteria that help differentiate right from wrong. One classical ethical standard is the categorical imperative proposed by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. It advises us to treat others as we would prefer to be treated ourselves. In Christianity, this standard is also nicknamed the Golden Rule. Another popular one is the principle of utility, elaborated by British philosophers Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. It holds that something is right when it produces the greatest practical benefits for the most people. We all employ ethical standards as tools for making countless decisions in our everyday lives. The application of ethical standards to relationships between human and non-human entities is called environmental ethics. It's hard to resolve. It depends on a person's ethical standards and domain of ethical concerns. For instance, these questions here are some examples to consider. Is the present generation obligated to conserve resources for future generations? If so, how should we conserve? Can we justify exposing some communities to a disproportionate share of pollution? If not, what actions are warranted to prevent this? Are humans justified in driving species to extinction? If destroying a forest would drive extinct and obscure insect species, but would create jobs for 10,000 people, would that action be ethically admissible? What if it were an owl species? What if only 100 jobs would be created? What if it were a species harmful to people, such as a mosquito, a bacterium, or a virus? Again, our interactions with our environment can give rise to ethical questions that are difficult to resolve. Answers to such questions depend partly on what ethical standard a person adopts. We can think about how people's domains of ethical concern can vary by dividing the continuum of attitudes toward the natural world into 3 ethical perspectives or worldviews: anthropocentrism, biocentrism, or ecocentrism. Anthropocentrism is a very human-centered view, and costs and benefits are measured only by their impact on people. For instance, if cutting down a forest would benefit people and create more jobs for them and better economics, then an anthropocentrist would cut down the forest. Anything not providing benefit to people would have no value. Biocentrism is kind of the middle approach here, meaning that certain living things have value, and it could be human life and it could be non-human life. In this perspective, human life and non-human life both have ethical standing. Therefore, a biocentrist might oppose clearing a forest if it would destroy a great number of plants and animals, even if it would increase food production and generate economic growth for people. An ecocentrist, or ecocentrism, is the more holistic perspective than the other two. They judge actions in terms of their effects on whole ecological systems. Ecological systems, remember, contain both living and non-living things. They feel that protecting the whole system would then follow to protect its components, rather than protecting certain components doesn't always protect the whole system. So an ecocentrist values the well-being of species, communities, and ecosystems. And here's a diagram to help visualize that a little bit, with the anthropocentric value in the middle, biocentric, or excuse me, way in the center here, biocentric in the middle, and ecocentric showing the whole ecosystem. As industrialization increased on Earth, raising standards of living but amplifying human impacts on the environment, more people began adopting biocentric and ecocentric worldviews. For example, one of the key voices of the past was John Muir. He lived from 1838 to 1914. He was motivated by the rapid environmental change that he witnessed during his lifetime, and by his belief that the natural world should be treated with the same respect that we give to cathedrals or churches. Today he's associated with the preservation ethic, which holds that we should protect our natural environment in a pristine, unaltered state. He argued that nature deserved protection for its own sake, which is an ecocentrist argument. But he also maintained that nature promoted human happiness. Everybody needs beauty as well as bread, he wrote. Places to play in, and pray in, where nature may heal and give strength to body and soul alike. Some of the factors that motivated Muir also inspired Gifford Pinchot. He lived from 1865 to 1946. He founded what would eventually become the U.S. Forest Service and served as chief in President Theodore Roosevelt's administration. Like Muir, Pinchot opposed the deforestation and unregulated development of American lands. However, he took more of an anthropocentric view of how and why we should value nature. He espoused the conservation ethic, which holds that people should put natural resources to use, but that we should have a responsibility to manage them wisely. That we should allocate resources so as to provide the greatest good to the greatest number of people for the longest time. Pinchot and Muir came to represent different branches of the American environmental movement, and their contrasting ethical approaches often pitted them against one another on policy issues of the day. Nonetheless, they both represented reactions against a prevailing development ethic, which holds that people should be masters of nature and which promotes economic development without regard to its negative consequences. Both gentlemen left legacies that reverberate today in the ethical approaches to environmentalism. Another person important in environmental history is Aldo Leopold. He was a forester and wildlife manager that lived from 1887 to 1849. He actually took more of a ecocentric view, more of a holistic view. It said that one day he shot a wolf, and when he reached the animal, Leopold was transfixed by a fierce green fire dying in her eyes. The experience remained with him for the rest of his life and helped lead him to an ecocentric, ethical outlook. He eventually would write what's called the Land Ethic and a Sand County Almanac. Actually, he died before they both went into print, though. Many people today view him as one of the most eloquent philosophers of environmental ethics. He wrote that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. We're obligated to treat the land ethically, and the land ethic will help guide decision making. The struggle for environmental justice has been fueled by the recognition that poor people tend to be exposed to a greater share of pollution, hazards, and environmental degradation than our richer people. Environmental justice advocates also note that racial and ethnic minorities tend to suffer more than their share of exposure to most hazards. This may be because there's less information, or they're less educated, or have less access to information. A protest in the 1980s, shown right here in the picture, by residents of Warren County, North Carolina, against a toxic waste dump in their community, helped to ignite the environmental justice movement. The state had chosen the site to dump in the county with the highest percentage of African Americans. Warren County residents actually lost their battle in that they still built the waste dump there, but they actually won the war in the fact that it brought national awareness to what was going on. Despite progress, we're still poor. The poor are still suffering substandard conditions. As we explore environmental issues from a scientific standpoint throughout the book, will encounter the social, political, and ethical and economic aspects of these issues, and the concept of environmental justice will arise again and again. Environmental justice is a key component in pursuing the environmental, economic, and social goals of the modern drive for sustainability and sustainable development. Sustainability in our future. A guiding principle of environmental science is sustainability. It means living within our planet's means, such that Earth can sustain us and all life for the future. It means that we'll be able to leave our children and our grandchildren a world as rich and full as the one that we live in now. It means conserving the Earth's resources so our descendants can enjoy them just like we have. And it means developing solutions that work in the long term. Sustainability requires maintaining fully functional ecological systems, because we can't sustain human civilization without sustaining the natural systems that nourish us. We need to take care of what we have now, because without the stuff that the ecosystem services that we talked about earlier, humans cannot live. If we think of Earth's resources like a bank account, and we think that depleting resources are like drawing the money out of the bank account. If we deplete the resources, then we draw down the account. Natural capital is the accumulated wealth of the Earth's resources, and we're withdrawing our planet's national capital 50% faster than it's being produced, unfortunately. What we should do, what we must, is live off nature's interest, its replenishable resources, to be sustainable. Drawing down resources faster than they're replaced eats into our nature's capital, and we can't continue to do this for very long before we run out of our resources. Human population growth amplifies all environmental impacts. We're adding over 200,000 people to the planet each day. Our consumption of resources has risen even faster. Even though life has become much more pleasant for us, we've advanced technology and medicine and have plenty of food, at least in wealthy areas. But rising consumption increases the demands that we make on the environment and our Earth. And unfortunately, the increased affluence has not been equal, and the gap between the rich and the poor countries has tripled in the past 40 years. And again, ecological footprints are not all equal. Ecological footprints of countries vary, and the U.S. footprint is much greater than those of developing countries. As we see our big foot pictured right here, compared to the smaller footprint of a place like India or Mozambique. Increased population and consumption cause erosion from agriculture, deforestation, toxic substances, mineral extraction and mining, and problems incurred from that, depletion of fresh water, air and water pollution, global climate change, and loss of Earth's biodiversity. Throughout our book, we'll talk about these different topics. This is an interesting chart on how humans have heavily influenced the U.S. We find Minnesota here. We see that we are in kind of the orangish red zone, which means we've had a high influence index in our area. The 2005 Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was a most comprehensive scientific assessment in the condition or of the condition of the world's ecological systems. The scientists with more than 2,000 leading environmental scientists assessed the situation of the earth from 2001 to 2005 and considered the capacity of the earth to continue supporting us. They found our degradation of environmental systems as having negative impacts on all of us. But with care and diligence, we can still turn many of these trends around. Sustainable solutions must enhance the quality of life and protect and restore the environment that supports us. Many solutions exist. For instance, renewable energy sources like solar, wind, geothermal, and ocean power are being developed to replace fossil fuels. We'll look at that more in Chapter 16. Energy efficiency efforts continue to gain ground, which is Chapter 15. Scientists and farmers are pursuing soil conservation and high-efficiency irrigation and organic agriculture. We'll talk about that more in Chapter 7. Chapters 5 and 13 talks about laws and new technologies that have reduced air pollution in wealthier nations. Chapter 8 discusses conservation biologists that are helping to protect habitat and safeguard endangered species. Chapter 17 discusses better waste management and how that's helping us to conserve resources. Chapter 14 will discuss how governments, businesses, and individuals are taking steps to reduce emissions of the greenhouse gases that drive climate change. Those are a few of the many efforts we'll examine while exploring sustainable solutions in the course of this textbook. We must use resources to satisfy our needs, but leave enough resources for the future. That would satisfy the triple bottom line. The environmental, the economic, and the social goals would all be met. We must limit our environmental impact while promoting economic development and social justice. We need to make an ethical commitment to current and future generations and apply science to solve problems. The single most important question we face today is, how can we develop sustainably? Is there such a thing as campus sustainability? Well, of course. College students can and are making a difference. Together, the 4,500 campuses in the United States generate about 2% of the U.S. carbon emissions. Reducing the ecological footprint of a campus can be challenging, but together, students, faculty, staff, and administrators on thousands of campuses nationwide are working together to make the operations of the educational institutions more sustainable, which sets a good example for other institutions and for other people and promotes good habits for us all. They're doing things like recycling programs and promoting efficient transportation options. They grow organic gardens, plant trees, and restore areas with their native plants. They find ways to conserve energy and water. They urge the institutions that they attend to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the use and investment in renewable energy resources such as geothermal and wind energy. In conclusion, finding ways to live sustainably on Earth requires a solid ethical grounding, scientific understanding of our natural and social systems. Environmental science helps us to understand our relationship with the environment, informs our attempts to solve and prevent problems. Identifying a problem is the first step in solving it. Environmental science can help find balanced solutions to environmental problems. Finding effective ways of living peacefully, healthfully, and sustainably on our diverse and complex planet requires a solid ethical grounding as well as a sound scientific understanding of natural and social systems. Environmental science helps us comprehend our intricate relationship with our environment and informs our attempts to solve and prevent environmental problems. Although many of today's trends may cause concern, a multitude of inspiring success stories give us reason for optimism. Identifying a problem is the first step towards devising a solution, and addressing environmental problems can move us toward health, longevity, and peace and prosperity. Science in general and environmental science in particular can help us develop balanced, workable, sustainable solutions and create a better world for now and for the future.